Kathryn Colasanti. I took the initiative to invite her to join us after seeing her quite wonderful reports on what's happening with urban agriculture, the potential and some of the facts, and some very interesting material on attitudes around the community, both which reports are included in your materials. She's an academic specialist with the Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. She works in multiple topics, including urban agricultural, farm to school, beginning farmers, etc. She does both research and outreach, and she's currently working to coordinating the state policy initiative, researching school and really looking at small-scale agriculture in a variety of contexts. She has an MS in Community Food and Agriculture from Michigan State University, and she researches food supply capacity along with resident and stakeholder perspectives. So, Kathryn, if you will come forward with the light.
Thank you, Professor Hand, and good morning, everyone. How's this volume, okay? So thanks for joining us here today and being here bright and early. This morning I thought I could share a little bit with you first about just the history of the urban agriculture movement, and then some of the breadth of activities, motivations, benefits, and impacts associated with the movement today, just to set the scene for the Urban Farming Symposium. And then I'll talk a little bit about the master's thesis research I did on urban agriculture here in Detroit, starting first with the assessment of the quantity of vacant land in the city, then looking at a food production capacity analysis, and finally looking at resident perspectives on the possibilities for scaling up urban agriculture in the city and what that might mean. So as you may or may not know, Detroit has historically been a leader in urban agriculture. The city actually claims to have the oldest community garden initiative in the country, dating back to the economic depression of the late 19th century. So then Mayor Hazen Pingree promoted utilizing of vacant lots for growing food, in a model that was later followed by Chicago and Boston, among other cities. So Mayor Pingree became famous for the potato patches that he promoted. And then about a century later, in the mid-1990s, was when the urban farming movement again began to take root here in Detroit. But really, I think even beyond Detroit, it's worth noting that urban agriculture is not a new phenomenon. It's something that we tend to think about and maybe talk about as a new phenomenon, but it really is as old as cities themselves. So urban scholars and historians, including Jane Jacobs, have noted that food growing was part of city life from the time of the earliest cities, and it remained so up until the point of widespread industrialization. Thank you. But there have certainly been times throughout our history where urban agriculture has taken on additional significance, particularly during economically depressed times and during the First and Second World Wars. A statistic that's often given is that during World War II, as much as 40% of the fruits and vegetables that Americans were eating came from urban garden cultivation. But the most recent movement began in the 1970s as a response to urban blight and decay, and as a way to reach out to marginalized communities. So it was really more of a response to the social conditions of inner cities at that point in time, rather than being about food production in and of itself. But I think even more recently what we're seeing is an awareness that gardens can play a number of different roles, including roles that are relevant to some of the major issues of our society today, including health problems resulting from poor diets or low levels of physical activity, and the challenge of designing our urban spaces in line with the natural resource capacity of the earth. And I would argue now that we're seeing a new phase where we're thinking about urban agriculture as a more comprehensive and proactive strategy for cities, as opposed to a piecemeal or ad hoc approach, where it's even more important to think about the zoning and master planning implications. And especially because we're seeing new types of activities emerge, including commercially oriented urban agriculture and animal-based activities, whether it's beekeeping or keeping of chickens in the backyard, maybe even goats. These activities tend to have greater implications in terms of policies within the city. And we're also seeing new stakeholders come to the table, including public health professionals, architects, landscape designers, funders, and planners. A note on terminology, too, I should have mentioned. When I use the term urban agriculture, I think it's used in different ways. People also use urban farming, urban gardening. But when I use urban agriculture, I'm thinking of that as the umbrella term that encompasses everything from really small scale gardening at your home to larger scale commercial enterprises, anything that involves cultivating food within the city limits. We're also seeing increased municipal support for urban agriculture. So London and Vancouver have both had initiatives to create more than 2,000 gardens in honor of the Olympics that Vancouver hosted in 2010 and that London will be hosting this summer. Cities like Portland have conducted citywide land inventories in order to identify all possible spaces that could potentially be utilized for urban agriculture. And we've seen a proliferation recently of zoning and ordinance changes in order to make urban agriculture legal within city limits, including within cities like Cleveland, Denver, Nashville, San Francisco, many others. And we're also seeing an increased proliferation of the debate, I think, around zoning and ordinance changes and what urban agriculture, what the appropriate role for urban agriculture is within a city, which I think reveals a certain degree of societal uncertainty still at this point about what the most appropriate role is. So if we think about, one of the unique things I think about urban agriculture is its ability to adapt to so many different settings. And this is one of the things that I think makes it distinct from rural agriculture or traditional farming in rural settings. So we see urban ag cropping up in all different types of settings, from school gardens to food banks to community gardens in neighborhoods. One of the more recent trends, accelerated by Michelle Obama, subsequently adopted by the Queen of England, is to have gardens on the lawns of public government buildings that really play a major PR role, are very symbolic. We're seeing gardens at city halls in different cities. And then another dimension of urban agriculture is growing on impervious surfaces. So this could be everything from green roofs to vertical gardening, hydroponics, indoor mushroom production, aquaculture, container gardening, these kinds of things. And if we think about all these different possible settings, what we really notice is that urban agriculture can have a wide array of different purposes. So it's about food, but it's also about more than food. If we start by thinking about individual reasons to engage in gardens, it might be for greater food security, healthier food, for exercise, recreation, mental relaxation. We can also think of gardens in terms of presenting opportunities for youth, for hands-on education that's integrated with their school curriculum, or simply productive engagement within the community, cultivating a sense of responsibility, initial job training skills. From a communal perspective, we could argue that gardens are really about bringing people together in a neighborhood and strengthening social ties. Gardens can also provide immigrants an opportunity to maintain connections to their agrarian heritage and to cultivate crops that might not otherwise be available. And then lastly, urban gardens and farms can offer a relatively accessible realm of entrepreneurship or job training. So if we dig a little deeper and look at what are the impacts and benefits that have been attributed to gardens in the research, first we see that gardens have been shown, or that research has shown that people who engage in gardening tend to increase their consumption of fruits and vegetables. And there's also some initial research to indicate that there are higher levels of physical activity seen by people engaged in urban gardens. Research has documented multiple social psychological benefits. So gardens have been described by researchers as a venue for facilitating community engagement and sharing across cultures, as a way for youth to experience their capacity to contribute to a neighborhood, as a tangible and visible site that enables people to work towards a common goal, and a venue that can catalyze further community organizing for neighborhood improvement. Cited environmental benefits have included improved air quality, preservation of cultivatable land, improved urban biodiversity, waste and nutrient recycling, stormwater management, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And then from an economic standpoint, one benefit of transitioning vacant land into urban agriculture is simply the savings that it can represent to a city with reduced maintenance cost of vacant land. I know Detroit spends millions every year just simply cleaning and maintaining vacant lots. And then lastly, research out of New York City demonstrated that the property values of homes in the vicinity of a community garden actually increased relative to other comparable homes after the establishment of a garden. So I turn now to the research I did here on urban agriculture, looking at first the assessment of the quantity of vacant land in the city. A couple of caveats first here. This research was primarily done in 2008 and 2009, so it is a few years old now. And then secondly, I'm at Michigan State. I don't live in Detroit. I'm not from Detroit. So there are a lot of people who are involved in the urban agriculture movement here in the city who are doing really great work, and I don't want to claim to speak for any of them. I'm simply presenting my interpretation of my research results. So in order to look at the quantity of vacant land in the city, we purchased a database from the GIS Sales and Service Center here in Detroit, which was a database of all of the parcels in the city. It originated from the assessor's office. And we looked at all of the parcels that were publicly owned, so either by the city, the county, or the state, or a land bank of one of those entities. But we wanted to exclude park space, so we excluded any of the parcels that were owned by the recreation department. So the result of that analysis was 44,000 vacant properties, about 4,800 acres, or 7.6 square miles. This represents just about 5.5% of the footprint of the city. And these numbers may seem high, but you may also be familiar with some of the popular press estimates that put the quantity of vacant land at closer to 30 to 40,000 acres, or roughly a third of the city. So this is certainly low in comparison to that. It's my understanding that no one knows exactly where those numbers come from, but some of the reasons why this could be lower would be a lot of the vacant land may be still privately owned or not have a clear title. Those estimates might be also including land that had an abandoned structure, which this does not. But the bottom line is we think this is a fairly conservative estimate. So this is a map of the city showing the distribution of those vacant parcels that we cataloged. So you can see they really are spread out across all parts of the city, although there are certainly areas where the concentration is higher than others. So if we look at those squares 1 and 2 at a greater scale, gives a comparison of neighborhoods that have higher and lower levels of vacancy. So in lower vacancy neighborhoods, we tend to see scattered individual vacant parcels, whereas in the neighborhoods with high levels of vacancy, there's a lot of contiguous vacant parcels. And this is just an aerial view of that parcel on the right side of the screen in the previous slide. And you can just see how much green space there is. And I used aerial images from 2005 in order to assess the accuracy of the parcels that I had categorized as vacant. So I took those two subsets and compared them to aerial imagery and found only about a 3.4% error rate there. So that I thought was fairly decent. And then another way to think about the opportunity, I think, for repurposing some of the vacant land in Detroit is to think about the density of the city relative to other major cities. So this is a map created by UDM professor Dan Patera in the School of Architecture. So just showing that the footprint of San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan could all fit within the city of Detroit, and looking at the relative density of the different areas. So Detroit has about a tenth the density of Manhattan, less than half of San Francisco, well under that of Boston as well. So of course this is not to say that we think Detroit should be as dense as Manhattan, but simply that there may be opportunities to think about utilizing some of the land for other purposes within the city. So turning now to a production capacity analysis, I asked the question, how much of the fresh fruits and vegetables that Detroiters eat on an annual basis could feasibly be grown within the city? And could it potentially be done within the actual quantity of vacant land? So the methodology I utilized to answer that question started with looking at the actual levels of fruit and vegetables consumed each year by Detroit residents. So this was based on national consumption data. So it's making the assumption that the dietary patterns of Detroit residents are comparable to national patterns. And then using the population from the Census Bureau. And then from there, I looked at how much of the fruits and vegetables that are eaten here each year could be grown within city limits given seasonal constraints. So that was a matter of determining the number of months of the year that each of the different fruits and vegetable crops could be supplied locally. And I did that looking at different production scenarios. So first, just from the field harvest. Secondly, with utilizing storage capacity. So things like root crops and some other things, potatoes, onions, beets, carrots, these kinds of things can be stored effectively through the winter months. And then thirdly, I looked at utilizing season extension technology, hoop houses or passive solar greenhouses, which enable farmers to cultivate a number of more cold-tolerant crops through all 12 months of the year. And then the next step was to look at the actual number of pounds that would need to be grown in order to account for all the losses that occur in the supply chain from the point of production to the point of consumption. And then looked at how much land would be needed for each of those crops, so utilizing published yield levels. And I looked at a range of potential yield levels based on different production types, from small-scale bio-intensive models to what tend to be larger scale commercial published yields. And then the result was what would be the total acres needed to supply the maximum percentage of what's consumed annually. So what I found then was if field harvest, storage, season extension are all utilized, it would be potentially feasible for Detroit to grow about 3/4 of the vegetables that its residents eat each year and just under half of the non-tropical fruits. and that would take between about 600 and 3,600 acres, depending on the yield levels that are assumed, which again goes back to the production type. So if we take just the midpoint number there, about 2,000 acres, recall that that's less than half of what we conservatively cataloged as 4,800 publicly owned vacant acres in the city. So this is certainly not to say, you know, this is immediately feasible. There's obviously a lot of other factors that would go into reaching this level of capacity. It's not to say that this is necessarily desirable either. I think I see this analysis as just one additional point of information in the conversation, a hypothetical scenario that Detroit residents can consider as they think about how they may want to repurpose some of the vacant land in the city. And those questions, of course, bring us to what's an absolutely crucial dimension of this picture, and that is, what are the resident perspectives on urban agriculture in the city and on the idea of utilizing significant quantities of the vacant land in the city for urban agriculture. So these results come from a series of interviews and focus groups that I conducted, again, in 2008, with people from a range of demographics, various neighborhoods within the city, and with a range of different engagement levels in urban agriculture, from being part of nonprofits that were actively promoting and educating people on urban agriculture to people who weren't really engaged at all. So first, what we saw through the interviews and focus groups was a whole myriad of motivations that Detroiters expressed for urban agriculture, from just a better quality source of food to a desire to connect with where food is grown and coming from, desire to resist what was perceived as racism in current retail venues in Detroit, desire to create a food system owned by the Black community, desire to just foster community ties, to strengthen relationships with neighbors, a desire to create a sustainable food system, so one that would be based on food grown closer to home rather than transported across the country, practical desire simply to save money. We had a focus group with the Hmong community, and they were very interested in maintaining their agrarian heritage. A seniors group that we talked to saw gardens as a good opportunity for exercise and recreation. There were nonprofits that were engaged in urban agriculture simply as a way to provide food for the hungry, and were growing food on other people's behalf. And then others saw urban agriculture as an opportunity for job training. And then finally, others saw it as an opportunity for youth development. So beyond these different motivations, there was a whole range of perspectives expressed in terms of who people thought would be engaged in urban agriculture, whether it would be a very popular thing that a lot of people in the city would want to participate in, or more of a fringe activity, and what role people saw urban agriculture playing long-term in the development and the industry of the city, as well as, well, the purposes, of course, but the ultimate benefits that people perceived from participation. But what I thought it boiled down to was at least four underlying debates, and the first relates to the role of urban agriculture and how we conceptualize and define the city. So geographers would call this the urban normative or the urban imaginary, but essentially when we think of a city and the essence of what makes a city, is urban agriculture a part of that or not? So some of the quotes to illustrate the dichotomy of perspectives on this issue. One person described urban agriculture as a sign that the city of Detroit has died and is going back to its native landscape. And then on the other hand, I've had this vision for 20 years of turning Detroit into an agricultural powerhouse. Detroit could be known worldwide for being an inner city that grows food. So again, we're seeing on one hand, urban agriculture runs contrary to the very essence of what a city is, and on the other hand, could be the essence of what defines this particular city. So a second underlying debate that's very much related was whether urban agriculture could be a new primary industry for the city, could be really a strong economic development strategy that the city should proactively invest in, or on the other hand, is it more of a temporary land use? It's something that we'll condone until we have a better use for the land, until there's a stronger market for more traditional forms of development. A third debate relates to the social dimensions, so whether urban agriculture is a means of social change. We saw that in some of the motivations expressed earlier. So whether it's a means to initiate community organizing and pursue broad social change, or whether it's more of a temporary means to ameliorate problems like poverty, lack of healthy food access, but again, not looking to systemically change the root causes of those problems. And then a fourth underlying debate is essentially the same idea, but related to the food system. So whether urban agriculture is a means to reshape the food system, to kind of change the structure of how and where food is produced, distributed, and sold, or whether it's a rather insignificant supplement and sort of on the side, but it won't fundamentally change the dominant paradigm of where we're getting our food currently. So I would say through the interviews and focus groups that I conducted, the two ends of the continuum for each of these debates were expressed, but there were also a lot of perspectives in the middle. People like the idea of urban agriculture, but they also like the idea of preserving what's more traditionally perceived as the urban aesthetic. They want their city to feel like a city. And they like the idea of urban agriculture as a source for healthy, high-quality, fresh, organic food, but they also want to have thriving food retailers in the city where they can access the same kind of high-quality, fresh produce. But I think the basic argument that I would make through all of this is that as we as a society look to modify land use policies to support urban agriculture, we're not always paying enough attention to the diversity of motivation, purposes, activity types behind this umbrella term of urban agriculture. And while some of the different purposes can coincide, not all of them can. And there are different ways of designing urban agriculture spaces, different places to locate them, different populations to engage that will optimize some purposes over others. So I think we collectively need to do a better job of uncovering the diversity of motivations and being transparent about which purposes we're prioritizing, which populations we're most directly hoping to benefit. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge my professors, my committee members who supported me through this research, Drs. Ham, Norris, and Papacucci. Charlotte Litchens and David Connor also were involved in portions of this research. Of course, the Detroit residents who participated, and the Kellogg Foundation and the Fair Food Network for providing funding. With that, I'd love to take your questions. Well, historically, actually, Detroit was founded based on ribbon farms that were sort of set up perpendicular, I guess, to the river. So it was very rich agriculturally. So there is, in that sense, very high-quality soil in the city. I don't know the specifics and how much variation there is across the city. But I know that the groups that are engaged, the nonprofit groups that are engaged in urban agriculture activities are always testing their soil before they start, both in terms of contamination and the soil quality. So they're certainly paying attention to that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If governors emergency agricultural manager today. And you kind of sort of have the authority to do whatever you want. What would be your plan that you, if you have one, for Detroit and its urban agriculture?
Well, I know Kathryn Underwood here, who is on the City Planning Commission, is chairing the task force to look at the development of zoning policies for the city for urban agriculture. And I think, I don't know the details of their process, but I think I would want to do something similar and have a number of public hearings to talk about different desires, further flesh out the perspectives that I found in my research, and try to facilitate a transparent dialogue on what role do we want urban agriculture to play in the city, and then from there get to the policies to make that happen. I know the right to farm issue has been seen as the primary obstacle up until this point, so it's kind of preventing the city from even wanting to engage in developing local zoning because they were worried that it would be totally preempted by the right to farm issue. It seems like that is being addressed at this point. I'm not sure if it's to their complete satisfaction or not, but I think Melanie, I don't know who she is, but we'll be speaking more about that later this morning.
Yeah.
Maybe my question is going to be covered later in the program, but has anyone estimated what the cost per acre would be to obtain, it's vacant, but it's not free? And what, the clearing of the title, all of the clearing of the land so that it is acceptable for farming. Has anyone done the math on how much an acre actually costs?
Yeah, I haven't seen that math done, and there's a piece that you're, at least I heard directly referred to.
And then there's the piece of actually establishing the urban farm operation and understanding whether or not that will be profitable. And that's actually a question that I'm looking at right now through a current research project. So I have a partnership with 3 different urban farmers. One's in Detroit, one's in Flint, one's in Royal Oak, to track their revenue and expenses over the period of 2 growing seasons and look at all of those factors. How much did it cost to obtain the land, and will it actually be a profitable venture? But, yeah.
Detroit University professor Pat Keenan often said, "I don't know" is the right answer many times. And it's probably beyond your area of study, but at some point we have to say, is it economically feasible to put an acre of Detroit city land into production versus going out to Washtenaw or some other county and buying a 40-acre plot?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well,
But yeah,
that's
I
something for somebody else's master thesis.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
In your interviews with these residents, was there any support for CSA memberships? Were they interested in that kind of opportunity with these potential farms or with local businesses supporting the produce, or what kind of markets are available in this?
Kathryn, could you repeat the question? Yeah, the question was in the
Focus groups, was there any interest in engaging in CSA, community supported agriculture subscriptions? Is that right? I didn't hear all of it, but okay. That wasn't a direct focus, so it wasn't something that I explicitly asked, but the interviews and focus groups, a lot of them actually, not 100% of them, were conducted in partnership with my colleague who was looking at general perspectives on food access in the city and where people obtain food and their satisfaction with that. And then I was incorporating the urban agriculture piece to that. So I'm trying to think. There was a fair bit of discussion in a number of these conversations about, just where people obtain food. So there were certainly people who are part of CSAs or even are operating CSAs. I wouldn't say there was widespread awareness. And there was also speculation among some that they're, just not interested or have the time to source food from anywhere outside of the traditional, fast food, corner store type settings because, people have 2 jobs and 4 kids and have just a lot of constraints and barriers in their life that will make it more difficult to go out of their way to source food from something like a CSA. Yeah.
The city government is, as far as is this something that they're looking to promote or support or not?
I think they've been very cautious and slow to move. I think with the Hance Farm proposal especially has just scared a lot of people. And again, the right to farm issue. The city obviously is aware that there are hundreds of community gardens within its jurisdiction, even though none of them are technically legal. They're kind of just sitting back and not taking an active role at this point. So they've been, very cautious, and also in terms of facilitating the acquisition of vacant land for purposes like farms and gardens. I don't know directly, but what I've heard from people is that they've been not particularly helpful, so very slow to respond, not particularly strong in maintaining an accurate database of who has title to different parcels. So I think the city could, if they really wanted to make things like this happen, do a better job in that sense as well. But they do now have this task force that's looking at the zoning implications. I don't know if citizen-led petitions, no. It's possible that they're out there, but I mean, the city has the task force, and that's the mechanism that they see those changes coming from, yeah.
You noted that currently the community gardens in the city were not legal under existing law. Could you speak a little about the extent to which that has been an issue, if it has been, and if you foresee that being one in the future, or if you foresee that changing?
To my knowledge, it hasn't been. Yeah, so the question, he said that I wrote that farms and gardens are not legal under the existing law. And can I talk about the extent to which that has been a problem, or do I foresee it being a problem? To my knowledge, it hasn't been enforced, so it hasn't been a major problem for most of the gardeners that I'm aware of. But for proposals like Hance Farms that are much larger and on a commercial scale, it's much harder to fly under the radar or just sort of go unnoticed and go quietly about your business. So that has precipitated, I think, the city becoming slightly more engaged in the conversation to say, okay, this is really something that we need to deal with in one way or the other, yeah. Yeah.
The right to farm issue, and as if everybody in the room knows what this is.
Yeah, it's not really my area of expertise, and I think, again, another speaker will go into it more depth, but essentially the right to farm was set up to protect farmers from nuisance lawsuits, and particularly when urban areas are expanding into rural areas and there's a pre-existing farm, and then suddenly there's a suburban development adjacent to the farm, and the residents there say, hey, wait a minute, I don't like the sound of tractors at 5 in the morning, or whatever it may be. So it was meant to protect farms from the nuisance suits that might be associated with the encroachment of urban development. But the way it's set up is farms following certain practices are exempt from local ordinances, essentially. So they're protected under the state law. So now it's sort of moving in the opposite direction. We have a city, what if a farm comes in and then people bring nuisance suits?
recent proposal to the city about this big $100 million project. I can't seem to recall what it's about specifically, but I don't know if the RFC or RFS is involved with that at all, or has any.
Yeah, we are not directly involved. That was an instance of the news getting a little ahead of the story. So there was a recent Free Press article, I think it was Free Press, that talked about a MSU center that would be looking at innovations in urban farming. Essentially, it's in the idea phase right now, so there are conversations that are being had. There are some folks with MSU Extension and with the Product Center at Michigan State University that have been meeting with the Detroit Food Policy Council and other groups in the city. I think the Detroit Food Policy Council has helped to host some forums to have some initial conversations about this, but it hasn't gone beyond that stage at this point. The basic concept would be, if it moves forward, MSU would not be owning any land, so if anything, MSU would be leasing from the city, but it would be a partnership between residents and researchers at Michigan State to look into urban agriculture innovations and strategies. Yeah.
Although there are a lot of illegal farms operating in the city of Detroit, that the city does have programs or called the Adopt a Lot program, where people can acquire a permit to adopt a vacant lot, whether it's adjacent to a house or a residential lot within the city, and they can farm and get a permit for the city for that.
Great.
So there is a legal way.